Hi, everyone. So I think we'll just give people about 2 more minutes to roll in, and then we'll get started.
As we are sitting waiting, I can also just make sure that I do this. Yeah, that's easy, I think. Yeah.
Hello, by the way, do you mind if I record the talk?
No, I don't mind.
Okay,
I don't.
Perfect, thank you.
Maybe
Recording in progress.
maybe we can finally, record the Numenon. That would be. There it is.
Great.
Okay, so I pretty much think we can start. So hello everyone and welcome to the opening session of the Society for the Philosophy of Sex and Love online seminar. I'm Eli Benjamin Israel, a PhD student at Temple University, and I'll be the seminar's host. The SPSL director, Jordan Pasco, will serve as this session's chair. And I also want to express my personal happiness to have Helga Varden here that accepted to be our very first speaker in this series. Before we start, I want to speak a few things and introduce the series before we actually get into philosophy. So when I started my PhD in the US at Temple, I contacted Jordan to hear a little bit more about the society. And one of the very first things she told me is that she encourages very much initiatives, especially from graduate students of talks or whatever we would like to make of this society. And we really love this approach. So not too long after this, we've come up with the idea of this seminar as a platform that will allow researchers in the growing fields that involve sex and love to share and discuss their ideas, and above all to create some kind of community that may in the future collaborate with each other. So very happy to see the huge interest on our call for papers. We had I think over 50 proposals, which was really amazing. And in my personal opinion, we have selected a great list of speakers. Some of them are here. That really fosters gender equality and diversity with researchers from various institutions from all over the world at different stages of their careers. So I'm very happy about that. And I want to thank you all for joining us today. And I wish us a wonderful series this academic year. So Jordan, you may continue from here.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Eli, and thank you all for coming. I do want to say what Eli said about his proposal of the series is completely true, and it is how we try to run the Society for the Philosophy of Sex and Love. And so I want to just extend that invitation here. If anybody has proposals for a series, for a manuscript workshop, a reading group, a study group, reach out to us and let us know. We've done several things that are sponsored by graduate students, for graduate students, junior faculty. So even if you're new here and you have an idea and you want to explore it, let us know, and we'd be really happy to facilitate and support any ideas that you have. Because that's what the society is here to do, is to forge those connections and to support these kinds of initiatives. So I want to thank Eli, first of all, for the idea for this seminar and for a lot of the legwork of putting this seminar together. We have a really exciting lineup. Eli, will you share the flyers for everyone in the chat when you have a second so that everyone can see what we've got going on? We've got talks, one talk a month for the rest of this academic year. And we will keep that up on our Facebook page, on our website, and on our email list for those of you that subscribe. And if you don't, please reach out and I would be happy to add you. So I'm extremely excited today to begin this series with Helga Varden, whom many of you might know as the former director or co-director of the Society for the Philosophy of Sex and Love from, I believe, 2008 to 2018, right, with Patricia Marino. Helga shaped SPSL into a supportive space where many of us found philosophical homes. And this is only one of the many ways that she has cultivated philosophical communities that make space for diverse scholars in a number of different spaces. For women and LGBTQIA scholars, for those committed to engaging these questions within philosophy and doing so in new and innovative ways. Many of us, me included, are here because of doors that Helga opened. And I'm grateful for all of the ways that she has made space for us and made models of how to do this within philosophy. Helga's groundbreaking scholarship on Kant and sex has transformed both Kantian discourses and the ways that Kant shows up in philosophies of sex and love. Helga has been thinking about love, marriage, sex, caregiving, and intimate relations in Kant for, I think, 2 decades now, and has published a range of papers that have developed innovative ways of thinking about these questions in Kant, in feminist, and in queer scholarship. Her book, Sex, Love, and Gender, A Kantian Account, is a groundbreaking approach to these questions, which not only offers a comprehensive overview of how these questions arise in Kant's theory of justice, but develops this really innovative reading of Kant's understanding of the human and of the place of love, sex, and gender in that conception. While grappling with Kant's many limitations, which we all know are there, Helga offers us a queer Kant, attuned to our experiences as vulnerable beings in intimate relationships with one another, and to the forms of deep belonging, fulfillment, and trauma that can arise in these relationships. So in today's talk, Helga draws on these resources to offer us an account of playful sex, something that I think we all need in the wake of a pandemic that has left many of us feeling anything but playful. So it is my great delight to hand it over to Helga and to welcome her back to SPSL.
Thank you. So thank you, Eli, for doing this, and thank you for carrying on SPSL in new directions. So wonderful. The spirit lives on. Here's something new happening, and it's completely consistent with all the way, certainly to 2008. And thank you, Jordan, for having taken over the SPSL. It's only possible to do this if we have somebody really solid at the steering wheel. And Patricia and I, when we thought now we really need to hand over the society to somebody new, we just immediately both said, Jordan, she can do it. You know, she gets it. And I'm so glad to see that we were right in the judgment, because this is a very, very important space. So thank you. Thank you too for the wonderful introduction. It's probably the case. I believe it's fair to say. You get to object though, Jordan, if you want. Jordan is one of 5, I think, who know my work the best. So that scholarly side of me. It is so wonderful to see how you describe it. And that it matters. Okay, so let me start. And no, at any time, I'm totally fine with you, stopping and saying, hey, could you do that one more time? Or could you explain it, etc. Also, I wish it was pure playfulness I'm going to talk about, but I'm probably going to talk a bit about the serious stuff too that Jordan mentioned, because I think playfulness, playfulness can be healing, of course, but playfulness, to do it well, requires a lot of judgment. And so from the very fun parts of life or moments of life or stretches of life, down into the not so fun places and back up again, it requires a lot of emotional resources to be able to do that. And I do it with philosophy. That is my passion, not in Kant's sense of passion, though maybe sometimes. My deep interest is in understanding systemically how to develop the Kantian position such that it can actually speak to these complexities. So, and since the focus is on playfulness, at least until you do Q&A, I'll focus on giving you an introduction to how I think of the human and the various types of resources Kant has to offer, or the Kantian position maybe, has to offer when we try and understand these parts of us philosophically. So I'm not a therapist, for example, right? I'm not a religious leader. I'm not, and many things I am not. I'm not a sex worker who's very good at this. I am a philosopher. So those are the kinds of resources I potentially have, not to offer maybe, or to bring into conversation so we can understand it better philosophically. So now I'm going to share my screen. And in doing that, just because, as you know, I'm after the system and there's a lot of moving parts, and I suspect it's easier for you to understand it if I do it with the kind of a schema in good old Kantian form. So let me see if I still succeed at doing that. Good. Can you see it now? Can you unmute Jordan? Yeah, it's all right. So I'll leave it just like that, if that's okay. So as Jordan said, I've been working for the last couple of decades on developing the Kantian position with regard to both human being, but also to understand a lot of the complexities we face in life, including as sexual and gendered beings. And if you come to this talk, I assume you all have done some Kant. You wouldn't probably be here if not. But you are quite used to thinking of Kant in all likelihood, or the most common version of Kant out there is, depending on your level of education, is some version that focuses a lot on universalizing maxims, perfect, imperfect duties. If I were to do the same stuff with regard to legal political philosophy, it would be innate right, private right, public right. But as you know, we're putting that aside a bit today because of the focus on playfulness. So you're quite used to puzzle from the groundwork, second critique, that concerns what in this, you can see my cursor now, right? Yes. So you are basically quite used to thinking a lot about Kant in relation to what it is like to be a responsible being, and in particular how we have moral feelings. So as you know, I'm just talking some Kantianese to you, the moral law is experienced as a categorical imperative, as a moral feeling, and Kant's big claim in the groundwork is that you can only explain the ought of moral motivation, right, by appeal to our practical reason. And so insofar as you are moving to the other elements of Kant's account of human nature, this is preposition to good in human nature, you are probably also used to that element. This is being a rational being, or rational end setting, or universalizing maxims. So basically, if you do a sort of a standard intro course on Kant's moral philosophy or practical philosophy with regard to ethics of virtue, you have a lot of engagement here. So universalizing maxims, rational end setting, willing them as a law, doing it because it's the right thing. So this element here. If other bits of Kant are used to explain that, sometimes people will emphasize this, the highest good, which you also find a version of in the groundwork, which is to deserve to be happy, right? To bring happiness and morality into union. So this part, and then usually it's emphasized you have to deserve to be happy. That's the big claim. If you move over here, and if you write or repeat papers, you have Kantians telling you the story in this way, you also often will find some emphasis on moral character, what it is to be a truly moral being, which is to do what is right because it's right to do. So if you go up here to, the emphasis often will be on types of thought, will be on abstract, conceptual, theoretical, practical reason. So a lot of people will have this entrance to Kant. A lot of people will stay there. Let me complicate a little bit more now. We also know that, from Honore O'Neill roughly, it's probably not entirely fair on everyone, but from Honore O'Neill roughly through people like Thomas Hill, Barbara Herman, etc., in addition to this part, they have had a lot of emphasis on the social sense of self. So they will often revise Kant, change Kant or the Kantian position by appeal to various social phenomena or social situations. So whether it's about lying, about women, about this and that, often there's an appeal to the fact that we are social beings. And so they get a more complex story of Kant that uses these moral concepts, inherently moral reflective concepts, and then they add dimensions from the social sense of self. Do raise your hand if anything is like flying past too fast now. It's still the case, in my view. If you look at something like Herman, who also in her latest book, typically when they do this move here, they use example, they argue by example, which often Kant does too, especially in the metaphysics of morals. So you can see that that's a way to do it, right? You argue by example and show that there's problems with the view that only uses these tools to get to some complexities in human life. Nonetheless, in my view, it's still Herman and all the others I mentioned are still very moralized conceptions. That is to say, a lot of work usually is done by perfect imperfect duties to make the world better. What is it to make it more better? It's to make it more moral. I think it's better positions than the others, and I don't want to give up their many, many insights. But when you work on sex and love, if this is the only tool you have, including, for that matter, if you want to come to playfulness, it seems to me that more than anything, you get tools for the importance of respect, and you get tools for being careful with regard to presentation. So it's also fairly good when it comes to gender presentations, because there's something very deeply social about them. But you get, in my view, a view that is quite useful for a lot of friendship discussions, so not accidental that they often talk about friendship or about women. In other words, various types of phenomena where when you have these types of tools available to you, you can capture quite a lot. In my view, though, it's not enough. And a big deal for me in the book that I just finished is to show that it can't help you. It can't get into view. Things like sexual orientation, in my view, can also not get into view gender or sexual identity. And part of the puzzle then is that once, whatever our position we have, whether we get the very moralized, inherently reflective position, which are sort of super rationalized types position, Kantian positions, or you get the more social versions, the rest in Kant tends to be just sort of mushed into heteronomy, wherever you draw the line. So there's autonomy, right? And then maybe autonomy with social sense of self, or all of this is just heteronomy. It's like desires and things, whatever, kind of. The challenge with that, if that's your position, is that a lot of our sexual affectionate life, in my view, you have to go to these tools in Kant or philosophically to get into view. It is impossible, I think, to be able to explain sexual identity or gender identity or sexual orientation without having these tools available down here. So I'm going to spend a lot of the time today on showing how the position transforms once you use those tools too. In addition, and as I will then spend the rest also of the time, it's going to be part of this, try and give you a sense of once you let all the tools in Kant's position do its own work, and I'm totally happy to say that I re-envision some of it. I care about the philosophy here more than the whether or not, and to capture every writing of Kant's. But if you develop them also with regard in light of all the tools you find elsewhere in Kant, you end up with a position that, among other things, can speak to much more of the complexity in sexual loving being, gendered being, and also with regard to playfulness. So let me try and give you as many tools as possible and then start hinting at playfulness, and then we can do Q&A to sort of explore the position, and you can figure out whether or not you think it's useful. Okay. So there is a deep connection, I think, between the moves you do over here and how you think of this complexity in Kant. So the types of thought available to human and other animals, perhaps, because how these play into and interact with these depends on what kinds of moves opens up philosophically for you. So on the position I am currently defending anyway, until you have had Q&A and convinced me otherwise, this part, according to Kant, is fundamentally, let me tell the story this way. Fundamentally, developing our animality or to be a living being does not require abstract conceptual thought capacities or theoretical or practical reason. In other words, other animals, for example, and us too, can develop our animality through associative thought. What is animality? Well, in my view, it is a kind of reflexive or self-reflexive conscious striving. It's there for all animals, and it's oriented, or Kant's proposal anyway, which I like, is that there are three types of strivings to it. And these three strivings are given by the three relational categories of the understanding. This one is substance. This one is community. And this one is causality. What that really means, in my view, is just that as animals are consciously striving, so the mind is involved, it's a priori, it's there as orienting the striving of a self. It's as we are newborn, as soon as we are born, and other animals too, we strive to preserve ourselves. We are susceptible and responsive to affection, to community with others, being held on our body, on our parents' body, for example, or spoken to affectionately. It calms us. And we are responsive to sensuous touch. In my view, developing this, whether you're an elephant or a human being, does, in other words, not require abstract conceptual thought. In fact, it's not there yet as an ability. Newborn babies do not have abstract conceptual thought. They do not have capacity for an I, which Kant argues other places. They can't think the I yet. It takes quite a long time to do that. But certainly also they can't do abstract conceptual thought. It takes a long time. And we can develop this associatively, like the other animals do.
Recording stopped.
So rather, one way to think of it then is that it's a type of striving that's already there. It's a priori for Kant. And what guides it? Well, in my view, the best way to do it is to, I think, take Kant seriously when he thinks that there is something called a natural vital force in us. That is, there is a natural vitality that we subjectively experience as being forceful, harmonious, or in conflict, that we regulate our basics, pleasures and pains related to this already from when we are born. So a happy day for a newborn baby, a harmonious day, involves eating, peeing and pooping, sleeping, being held, no weaning, yes? And if it's harmony, I think on this type of position, and I think for Kant too, it is that the the pleasures and pain are internally also regulated by the natural vital force. The baby stops eating when it's full. What does it regulate that with? Well, the way in which the natural vital force is experienced. So this matters quite a lot in our, let me do it a little bit more. Also, notice that already from little babies, they use a lot of associative thought. They associate the scent of loving caregivers, sounds, etc., with pleasures or pains, right? It doesn't take that long before the parent or other loved ones, the newborn baby knows the sounds, knows the scent, and whether or not those sounds and scents are present matters for whether or not the baby stops crying or is harmonious. So it's associative thought, like others too. As we develop, Kant thinks too that the human being, when we are born, also have a very brute sense of freedom. It's there already when we are born, and according to Kant, it's revealed in the fact that human babies scream when they are born. So no other being we have met so far anyway scream when they are born. Human beings scream. And Kant thinks philosophically you can only explain that by the fact that human beings are frustrated by the fact that they cannot act. So it's like a brute freedom present all the way from the beginning. Finally, and that's all the moves I need now to start getting closer to playfulness, is also the case quite early on that the baby starts to smile. And this is the Rousseauian influence on Kant, right? So when the baby starts to smile to the caregiver, it reveals pleasure in seeing and being seen for Kant. So it shows much more reflective, sophisticated reflective activities are going on, because you can only explain it philosophically, Kant thinks, by appealing to a notion that the baby is aware of being seen and that it is pleasant. So in other words, there's something originally, Kant argue, pleasant about it. You take pleasure in being seen and in seeing the other. From that onwards, Kant quickly agrees with Rousseau that it's a source of great instability for us, because this is the social emotions like jealousy, envy, etc., is all rooted here. Now I'm not going to say much more, because the rest of the story you know really well, meaning that you zoom forward a little bit in child development and the human being starts to set ends, reaches for things, learns to act on maxims, keeps developing. The more you can do abstract conceptual thought on this story, the more you're able to think about whether or not the maxim, the rule can hold as a law, etc., if it's morally permissible. And developing all those capacities is to develop the capacity for being a responsible being. Okay, but that's the story we all know. So now I'm going to go back to that story, the main part for this story, or what I am after here. I should explain the other ones quickly too, in case you haven't done these much more. So once you develop that really firmly on the Kantian story, you start developing what Kant calls a moral vital force. And the more you are able to act in that way, the moral vital force, act on it, the firmer you are in your character, meaning that it's not even tempting to do the wrong thing. Or the more it's obvious, like, why did you do what you did? You did the right thing? Well, because it's the right thing to do. Well, of course I do. And the better the character, the better it is the case that that's just how you go about life. Okay. So on this view then, bring happiness and morality into union, or into close union. You can never really make them into union. We don't have that kind of control over life. You can say it with regard to trying to bring happiness and morality into union, or you can say it with regard to getting these two forces, subjective senses of vitality, into harmony. Then you are a harmonious being. Okay, so now then go to playfulness. If you have this tool, these tools with you, when you start talking philosophically to things like playfulness. Notice that these lower ones here, as I explained, are at its base reflexive only. They are not inherently abstract conceptual. So, or put it differently, they're reflexive at their base, not reflective. In other words, it's a striving of a self, but at their base, it's not a type of striving that inherently appeals to how we can think about things. Okay, so when I am, here's a silly way of saying it maybe, but there is serious silliness, so here we go. When you are sexually drawn to someone, right, you sexually feeling the pull towards them, when you think about it, that you are drawn to someone, there's a deep way in which you take a reflective distance from that striving. Yes? So when you are drawn to someone, the reflective move is important to be responsible about striving, because sometimes when you are driven to someone, something happens that you're not sure about, and so you take a reflective moment. You step out back a bit to make sure you're not misunderstanding anything. So it's important, but it is also important that when things go well, as such, there's an important sense in which you are going with the flow. You're flowing in that drawing to the other. So far, so good. Notice too that there are other ways of being drawn to people, such as this one, the affectionate one. You can be drawn to someone just because you feel affection in relation to them. You feel lovingly open to them, like a kid, just to take a different type of example, just to get it clearly into view. You just feel affection for them, so, which is also a draw. Finally, the other type of draw on animality, self-preservation, and still doing it in this intimate sphere, is self-preservation, which very much has to do with whether or not you feel safe. Do you feel safe around someone? That person is in the room and you just feel, okay, I feel safe about it. So when we are doing playfulness, right, we can be playful with regard to all of these. We keep them all in mind, but there are many ways of playing, which is just keeping the other ones either reflectively. Let me do that one easier. Let me do it easier. Not to go too fast. I have 5 minutes. We'll do 5 minutes. So let me do the case of being very drawn to someone, or mutually very drawn to someone, to truly fall in love and lust with someone. Yeah. On this account, how are you drawn? On this account, when this is a very happy story, at least the starting point has this deep foundation where all the cylinders are fired, you feel very easily and very sexual around that person. You feel mutually. You are mutually feeling great amounts of affectionate love for the other person. And you mutually feel really safe with that other person. This is just at the reflexive level true. As it develops, you start having a good sense, and let's still have the very happy story here. You feel truly seen by the other. You feel that the other person really gets you and is able to respond to you in a way that tracks who you are. The person is not feeling the need to put you down, does not feel threatened by you, does not have games of envy or jealousy going on with you, which comparative unstable emotions. They just really enjoy seeing you flourish. This is a super happy story, as you can hear. Finally, if it's really still firing and all the great, on this type of story, the great sex, love, lust stories, the other one is still having an unsocial part of their sociality, which is valuable. The other one is very different from you, and that's not a bad thing. It's wonderful that the other person is different from you and vice versa. And so you support each other in being different, in realizing yourself as who you are as an individual. So if I were the one, there's an Helga involved, and Helga is different from, in this case, Shelley, who is my spouse. So there's a distinct Shelley, there's a distinct Helga involved, and we are supportive of each other being different from each other. Finally, on this account, there's a framework of respect that sets everything, that we do the right thing. So if some things are off, then we stop. And for Kant, it's always the thing you can always do is stopping. That's hence the nature of the perfect duties is don't. Okay, now, so once we have this basic picture then, so how do we develop playfulness? Well, in a certain sense, good judgment and playfulness keeps with attentive to all these emotional complexities about what kind of a relationship it is. If it is the full-blown thing, all of it is involved at all time and very much as an ongoing shared activity. If it is a one instance thing, one either goes to, say, a community where the rules are very clear, or we set the rules very clearly for what this is all about. But what does it mean to set the rules? It means that we pay attention to these types of things so that we can play safely. So that we put it differently, because sexuality and love involves this level, when things go badly wrong, it also affects us at that level, right? And once it affects us, something becomes unsafe, right? If something happens to us that makes us feel scared, then the situation or that person will be associated with fear. And so the play is gone. Of course, you can play on that too, but you can only play on that safely if you understand what is going on. Now let me I have like 1 minute, which usually in academia means 2. So let me then move it over on this side, right? So, and what then is it to play? I think these parts of Kant, which I've done very fast now, it shows us a lot of the kinds of tools we use. So on the one hand, we have various ways of imagining parts and wholes, and some play has to do with how we do that. What's a whole, what's a part, and imagining new parts and wholes. Similarly, what about the beautiful and the sublime? Being taken and taking, or various kinds of aesthetic experiences that can be embodied. It can do dress, it can do types of positions, types of relationships, types of positions, types of situations, and also things like drag, etc., etc. So it's all these ways in which we can use aesthetic tools to make it exciting and fun. But when we do, that's the type of judgment we use. Similarly, associative thought, we can both do it towards the individual, the more we know the individual, or we can do it in a way in which shows that we have a shared understanding. So there are tons of ways in which, say, drag or sex games or whatever, use associative thought that is shared, and that's part of how you play on it, is that there are certain kinds of associations like uniforms, right, that you then associate in a specific way and behaviors with that, and then you can play in relation to that association. Finally, also here, of course, one can play on the way in which we use these terms including by subverting them. Some will have sort of no as a yes, or it can be ways in which we talk very moralized when there's nothing moralized about what we are doing, right? And that can be in itself a sort of a source of joy. But all of it is always only really playful or joyful if we truly understand what we are doing. The things I didn't mention now is this stuff, but I'll leave that for Q&A because I think I've talked absolutely plenty. Thank you so much for your attention. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Helga. So I would like to propose that we just use the hand up emoji in the Zoom room, and we can just start a queue that way and take questions. If you don't have access to it, feel free to drop it in the chat or just wave at me and I'll add you to the list.
You might have to be the courageous one and set everyone up, John.
I know. Well, I do actually have a question for you, Helga. I mean, of course I do. So I will go first and then I'll pass it to Naomi. So my question is about this idea of, I love how you put this, of setting the rules, right? And setting the rules for playfulness, which I think is really important. And part of what I heard you get at here is that one of the ways we go wrong when we think of the rules as consisting sort of only of consent, only of that perfect duty to stop when I say stop, is that we're then setting the rules only at the level of personality. Is that right? And we've sort of missed all of the stuff below. So I wondered if you could flesh out a little bit more what's entailed in setting the rules on this kind of account.
Yeah, so I think so. I mean, I don't have sort of a pre-prepared answer to that question, so it won't be like that. I just think that if you want, I'm going to share the screen a little bit more when I talk about this point. Here's the thing. So when we are communicating, I mean, there are sometimes I think we just need to stop. Let me tell it from the point of view of wisdom, maybe, right? So Kant argues that wisdom is to know your heart. So to know how you're striving, to know, I think he actually talks quite well about this, and I think it's easy to go with this idea, to know what is true about you, what you're feeling. So part of the complexity of a life is to learn to develop concepts and learn to pay attention to how you're feeling. And if you're doing that with others, depending on how well you know each other, or how well you know the particular activity you are involved in, the wisdom comes in being able to read clues, right? So that you can just go on. But it's definitely the case that also being wise, if you're wise, it's not so hard to say, oh, time out, right? We might need to use some words right now in a very specific way because I'm feeling something. I need to make sure that I'm doing, and it's very easy to move back into the space again, right, of sexuality if one is wise about it. It's not hard and it's easy to use words, but it's also the case, right, on how you negotiate a lot of the time when being sexual is not about words. And on this account, of course not, because, or at least not concepts or this type of thing, do you now consent, right? It's like not getting the game if that's the only tool we have in the box, because a lot of it involves these judgments all the time. So it becomes an absurd activity if you constantly try and make it into this type of game, because this type of game kind of just sets a certain type of framework and is useful at times when you're not quite sure that you do exactly know what's going on, or you don't feel safe, or is not turning you on, or whatever it is. But a lot of the activity is here, right? So it becomes a sort of a very strange activity if all there is all the time is the tools available in abstract, conceptual, practical reason. That's a different it might be useful sometime again, including in relation to troubles relating to trauma and so on and so forth. But even then, I think the abstract conceptual has its limitations to get the thing to get really good, because you're trying to make a much bigger activity going on than what you can do with sort of simple back and forth tools. So not say that they're not important, but it becomes a very, very limited activity if that's all there is.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm going to pass it to Naomi.
Thank you so much, Helga. And this really makes it clear to me that I've been remiss in not reading more of your work. This is wonderful. And I love the way you're pulling these things together. Of course, as a feminist philosopher, the word playfulness immediately shouts Lugones. And I'm thinking about, in particular, one of her associations there is that the willingness to be a fool, to not claim or exercise mastery, to not be in control. And that seems to me to go along with what you're saying. And when I think about these things, my go-to thought is immediately about sneezing. I mean, I actually love sneezing. And there's this sense, I mean, the double sense in English anyway of dignity, both this important moral quality that we're required to respect in ourselves and others, but also the Peter Pan song, I won't grow up if it's beneath my dignity to climb a tree, and all of the sort of, you know, comportment, the kinds of things that Foucault, for example, talks about, and the importance of that, of comportment, of knowing how properly to be in the presence of other people, the things you do and don't do, and so on, and the things that really undermine that. But sneezing is not an affront to one's dignity. It's a reprieve from it, in a sense. And thinking about sex, the positions that you're in, the way your body looks, the way you're responding, the sounds you're making, I mean, it's all very, very undignified in that sense. And so I'm wondering about this sort of whether one of the things going on with playfulness is creating and finding, both finding and creating, situations in which you're not threatened, but you're also not morally at risk, that it's in every sense safe to just let it go. And the importance of that, the importance of our being the animals that we are in a way that is not always controlled by, but isn't incompatible with our being the rational moral beings that we are. And I'm wondering if that sort of set of associations, Lugones and sneezing and all of that, fits with the picture that you're developing.
I love that. So if you ever want to write a part of my paper, you can come and write that part, because I completely agree. I do think that these moments, especially, well, here's one way of saying it. It goes something, one puzzle for Kantians is how to explain, how to get these two senses of forcefulness into union, right? Or why, when Kant says developing your animality and humanity leads to morality, what does that mean? And very many take it to mean, well, because it becomes a moralized conception all the way, and it becomes the sage, and the sage who's the sage does the right thing all the time because it's the right thing to do, and that's always the moral motivation, as close as we get to living as an angel, etc., etc., etc. So my Kant is not like that, because I think it's not the case that that's a wonderful human life for very many. It's for some, I think. There are some people who have what I would call religious types of orientations to life, where that just is how they are hardwired. And for me, that's contingent. And when that is the case, whether it's the Dalai Lama or somebody else, it's moral. I recognize it as moral. I recognize it as good. I also recognize it as exactly a type of religious type of life, which then for whom happiness and animality and embodied life just doesn't have a type of hold or importance or value directly. They help others do it. They don't feel it. That's fine with me. But I think the human ideal, not the moral ideal of the sage, but the human ideal, the one that most humans have, is some version of, is one that animality leads to morality only in that it's possible to develop these animalistic forces and social forces such that they are not in conflict with morality's demands. If I were then to go back to your way of saying it, it would be that a lot of those activities are experienced as absolutely consistent with the dignity of the other person. Perhaps sometimes, especially when we're getting to know someone, we have more moments like that, where we in that activity take time to reaffirm that I deeply respect you, right? Just moments. It doesn't have to involve words, actually, just the way in which you look at the other, or the way in which you touch the other, or the way in which there are sort of moments like that. But as it's becoming better, more integrated, more transforming, its experience is obvious. And so there's a way in which those two forces come into the natural vital force, the moral vital force, are not experienced as possibly coming apart. And if they do, we become anxious or worried, right? So the more they are not, for all kinds of reasons, is because they are felt like in a close union. In that, we develop all kinds of associative, aesthetic, teleological tools to develop that. And so we can feel more, and we can, for that matter, use concepts to describe how we feel with more precision, or even moves that shows that you, that just means that you're flourishing. So it's, how can I also say it? One more to just to spin on, I think, what you are saying. A task for Kantians and others, philosophy in all its reflection, is to get the feet back on the ground, right? And to value earthly life and value animal life. It's amazing that we are animals who live on this spectacular planet. If we go in the very moralized ways or just the rationalized ways, I feel we lose that connection. And I think that loss of connection should be limited to sages, or to which often can be pure philosophers, right? And so in a sense, yeah, it's a break from dignity, but it's a, if we want to use the language of break from dignity, but it's only because we absolutely know there's no conflict. Right? That's why it's like, and then we get a break. One last spin, just because I like Hannah Arendt so much on this one. She thinks that to do philosophy is like a small death. What's the small death? Is the more you do it, you lose the sense of I and being an embodied social being. And an orgasm is also a small death, right? You lose it. But those two ways of losing it is two ways of getting a break that can be internally connected to extremely fantastic activities that also can have the small death involved. But it's two ways of filling yourself with a sense of vitality, a natural one or a reflective one. And they're both real. And they're both, from, if we want to just spell out the human ideal, they're both involved, in my view. Thank you for the question and helping me think.
All right, Eli, and then Gary, and then Klaus.
Thanks. Helga, it was amazing as usual. I wanted to ask you about the relationship between safety, between feeling safe and autonomy. This might touch on something that you already said, but I kind of lost connection for like 5 minutes for technical problems here. So if I do say something that you already said, I apologize. But you mentioning this necessity of feeling safe with your partner really connected to the experience. I really started to think about the experience of the sublime and how a very fundamental condition for having the positive pleasure there is to be in a safe position. And from the safe position, we have access to the very idea of autonomy. And I was wondering how, I think I can see how it can be also reflected in the interpersonal relation with our own partners, our own sexual partners, but I was wondering, how do you see it connecting in this aesthetical way?
Yeah, I'm not done with how to think of the sublime. So right now, I probably have, so in case some of you have never thought about the Kant and the sublime, but there's something about the feeling of sublime for Kant being interrelated to awe, is also being sort of something that pulls you up, right? And so when Kant has the starry heavens above and moral law within, it's ways of being sort of filled with awe. It also is the case that for Kant, that there's an internal connection between the fact that we are morally responsible being the moral law, and how that must be thought of as a thing in itself. And so there's an internal connection between us and the fact that we can be morally responsible, the moral law, and the universe as such, because that capacity we have to think in terms of maxim holding as moral, as universal law, is internally connected with being in the universe, not just us. And so there's something about the capacity we have there that is drawing to thing in itself. So what really explains being. So that's kind of that part of it. And I don't want to get rid of any of that. I think that's very compelling. So currently where I am on the Kantian project when it comes to the sublime, including in relation to sexuality, is that I think it needs to be complemented by the naturally sublime, right? So I think also to the experience of the sublime, and my best effort at the moment, as Jordan knows, is that when you Kant has the examples of moral law and the starry heavens above, perhaps one way to start trying to transform this part of Kant is to think of, for those who have ever climbed a mountain and are used to climbing mountains or maybe climbing trees. I actually totally think you can do it with climbing trees. Trees are amazing, in my view. Fantastic creatures, you know, unbelievable. Nothing like a tree, you know. Rivers too, probably, sailing the oceans, walking through the desert, for those who can do that. For me, is climbing mountains probably the one I know the best, so I use that one. There's something about climbing the mountain which is lost if you too quickly go to the starry heavens, because the starry heavens are up there and you can't engage them. The mountain you can engage. And here's the thing, when you climb the mountain, and I come from a heathen culture where that's what we do as our religious activity. We climb the mountains every Sunday. So when you climb it, it's something about what it does to you phenomenologically, right? A typical hike goes something like this. You start at the bottom of the mountain, you chat and you talk a bit about this and that. Or if you are walking on your own, you sort of think a lot about this week and whatever it is. But then as you climb the mountain, you talk less and less. And by the time you come to the top, it's no more talk. You're done talking for quite a while. And you've just been walking together up that mountain. And at the mountain, for a really good hike, there's this way in which you're just completely present. And you sense a type of vastness, of course, but you also sense having a place in it. So this is a very long way of saying that I think in sexuality, we can also have those experiences where getting there is part of how we can get a sense of the naturally sublime. Of course, you can have playful situations and experiences that go on that, but I think also into the constructions of those experiences, for those who like that way, there's a lot of attention to exactly that, even if it's at the intuitive level, namely how you can go from an experience to an experience that opens up vastness with your place in it. And at the same time, you can lose yourself in it. So it's something about naturally sublime. So that's kind of where I'm currently at. I'm not further along either. But it's an important reason, I think, for why you don't want to have a totally moralized conception where dignity is all, because all you're going to get then is the moral sublime. But I think there is natural sublime. So I think in a lot of S&M, well done, or a lot of sexual experiences and stuff, the naturally sublime is the one to use, not the other one. Put it differently also, the other one is inherently disembodied. The naturally sublime is inherently embodied. And it involves your own body. I don't know if that was useful.
Thank you.
Gary.
Thank you for your paper, Helga. I enjoyed it very much, and I've been enjoying the discussion as well. I think I have a question in here, but I have it has a little bit of philosophical prefacing. So I'm thinking about the relation between play and rules in the sexual context, but first I was thinking about it in a broader context, because lately I've been starting to do some work on sort of philosophy of games and philosophy of sport and its relation to the broader category of leisure. And I've been thinking about the difference between play and games, for instance, where games have a much more rule-bound. It's a more rule-bound form of play with a usually a telos to it and so on. Whereas I think play is the more broader idea, which doesn't always have an aim. It doesn't always have when we talk about child's play, there's not always rules, right? Children play and they're not really aiming at something, right? They're just playing. They're doing, and rules change. If there's any rules, they're very fluid. They change constantly and so on. So I got thinking about that in relation to the picture that you're presenting here, and the sort of relation between the rules and the playing, because in some sense there seems to be a bit of a tension between the rules and playing in a certain conception of playing, but in another sense, it makes a lot of sense, and especially if you think of morality as rules. So when in the last part, of the discussion, when you're talking about playing in a way that doesn't, I think you characterize it something like this, that doesn't defy morality or doesn't go outside of morality. I'm thinking of two different pictures, and maybe you can sort of tell me which one your notion fits best with. There's one picture where one has sort of internalized morality, internalized the categorical imperative or whatever moral standard, and so that even in sexual play, one has a sense of still treating a person as an end, and that guides one's play. But there's another picture that seems divergent from that, which is sort of a more romantic picture of the person that is not guided necessarily by this sense of duty, but and this one seems the more dangerous, and yet at the same time very human. One is guided by again, not a specific conception of morality, but is guided by, I can only think of something like their authentic self, right? You know what I mean? Which whatever that authentic self is, always runs a certain risk, right? So being true to oneself, right? Do you see it? I mean, do you see a tension there? I mean, or which of these? And this is maybe a bit of a loaded question, but which of these accords better with the conception of sexual play that you have in mind?
I might say neither.
Right. Okay.
Like,
That's
you
fair.
know, so there's something like when you said it, like, it's not quite what I'm after. Doesn't mean that, and I don't have a pre-prepared answer, so I can't just simply say because I don't know the answer yet. Maybe one would just, in another way of saying, I need to think about this for a long time. So maybe next time we meet, I will have the answer for you sort of ready. But go something like this, abstract conceptual thought and practical reason has its role. But I think that when it comes to when we move from activities that are inherently that to inherent activities that are a lot of associative thought, it has a lot of teleological thought, it has a lot of aesthetic thought involved. The aim is not to make all of that conceptual.
Right.
So if it is the case that I want philosophical tools that pays attention to that, so that the abstract conceptual thought, or what is able by practical reasoning, Kant's sense, does not try to invade all the spaces. There's a way in which it sets the framework, but it's ultimately also ultimately based on a feeling, a moral feeling, right? Which is always there, right? A feeling.
It is, again, I don't want to force what you're saying into a particular, but is it, I mean, I think David Velleman uses this kind of example in Love as a Moral Emotion, where the moral part is still there as a kind of, what's the word he uses, chaperone or you know what I mean? Something that even though the one doesn't think about it, one isn't, but he still sees it as guiding one in their interaction with another person, right?
Yeah, and of course, I don't want to get rid of that part, but I also don't want to get a moralized conceptual of element, right? Which is much too cognitive for me, in that sense of cognitive.
Agreed, yeah.
So perhaps one way I could do it, but I don't know yet, it's something like when is to use the moral vital forces more, right? It's when they come apart, right? Which is when you feel, oh, this is not flowing well.
Right.
Which is a time to stop. And sometimes then you have to use language, right? So it's like, if you're being sexual with someone, I think we just need to talk a little bit. I mean, so we have to use some concepts to figure things out, because there's something like it's not flowing well, right? Whether it's in yourself or you're sensing it the other, so you stop. Sometimes you don't need to stop. You can just look at each other and then you just do something nice and it's fine. You don't always have to use concepts. But I probably want to use vital forces more in the position I find convincing. But then maybe also, I liked a lot what you said about kids and playing. And I promised actually in this talk, so if you received the talk, I was supposed to talk about squash and I forgot. So, but there is a way in which I think the adult playing has a lot of that thing that kids are very good at, which is there's no end game in a certain sense. It's a way of doing a very fun, activity, meaningful activity, and can have all kinds of functions in our life. But the point is not to win, or the point is not to already know what this is going to be, but it is an evolving game. If I were to do with squash, and I use squash just because I love that game, that, you know, if you have a very good squash partner, then there is a point at which you could just say, fuck it with the rules. And even if it bounced twice, you keep going because the game is so good. You don't care that it bounced twice, you know, it's just such a good round. So you go with it, you keep going with it. And I take it that that's part of what I want to keep, right? That it's the game for the game's sake in a certain sense, not to win, not to have a small death as such, even though sometimes that is called for too.
Thank you. Thanks.
I need to think about more.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, Klaus.
Hi, I'm going to preface this by saying I'm only an undergraduate student, so I'm sorry if none of these thoughts are very sophisticated or like well thought out. But one of the things that I kind of wanted to ask is what happens when a person doesn't have a developed sense of like their abstract conceptual understanding of their sexuality? Because it seems that oftentimes when you're interacting with people, especially in like a sexual way, the only way you can actually express what you want and how you feel is verbally. So using that sort of abstract conceptual reasoning. But there can also be a sort of discordance between, you know, what one thinks they want, what they might actually want, and what they eventually sort of come to express. And if somebody is only really having sexual experiences that may be negative, but they think they may enjoy it and be misled because of the social component, then can they ever really get a like a sophisticated understanding of the sort of internal, I guess, locus of sort of the less like the wisdom component of it, I guess, that you mentioned earlier, where it's something that you kind of have to like reflect and think on. But if you kind of but how, like, I guess my question is, how do you develop this more non-social internal or reflexive component that might not even come to emerge because you're not exercising it in like the correct way, I guess? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Well, so first of all, on this view, there isn't such a thing as a sexual essence that you're trying to find. It's not like the answer is already written in your essence. So that wouldn't be what it is to be wise, right? So I don't have that thing going. And I think a lot of common intuitions among people is that they do think there is such a thing. I don't think that is the case. I also don't think most postmodern thought, including on sexuality, and a lot of other common thinking is correct in saying that everything is fluid, or to be woke is to be fluid. There is no such thing ultimately as sexual orientation or gender identity or sexual identity. I think there are such things as sexual orientations and gender identities or sexual identities. So I'm not constructivist all the way down. And so on my view, some of, if you just in Kantian thought, then if you have a moralist, a very rationalist view, you can't make sense of them anyway, but they are very consistent with constructing things all the way down. So I do believe that at the level of animality, right? So if I go back there to the, here, so this level is, and then becomes developed also with that level, is where you find sexual identity or sexual orientation. And I think it's revealed in how you are fundamentally experiencing yourself as sexual. So it's a sort of a slow learning game to learn if there's a pattern with regard to what other complementary types of embodiment turn you on. If there is a way in which other types of embodiment or similar types makes you feel affectionately open and safe. Also over here, whether or not it is the case that you feel drawn to being more the one who is more in control, more doing the taking, etc. Or if you like to have the power of being the one that draws and controlling the one drawn to you, which would be to have the beautiful, right? So that is not, in my view, what you can reveal. Human beings, we have patterns there, and I think that they are revealed to you typically quite early, including with trans, that you feel that the way in which you can be physically with yourself and others does not line up with how you've experienced yourself as beautiful, and then letting beautiful capture both the sublime and the attractive, the one drawing. So traditionally on a Kantian conception, and here of course I'm going beyond Kant, the beautiful is internally linked to femme or the feminine, and the sublime to butch, masculine, or whatever. So
thank you.
yeah.
Oh, sorry, I just wanted to.
Yeah. So no, but it is the case that one can pay attention to it, because you can figure things out, but you can't figure things out except carefully trying. And then you had something follow up there.
Oh, I just wanted to say that I've always wondered if there was any sort of literature on like an aesthetic understanding of being trans or like gender identity as well, because usually what I normally see is the psychological or the social view, and less popularly nowadays like the naturalist take, and it's actually really interesting that you kind of tied that in. I just thought that was really cool. Sorry.
No, it's cool. No, it's part of what why I went with the position I went with. So for a long time, I defended basically something like Simone de Beauvoir, who's constructivist all the way down. And if you take somebody like Judith Butler, postmodern, very inspired by Butler, she's also constructivist all the way down. And the reason I realized that it's wrong, or I believe now it is wrong, was actually I had a student who was trans, and I was standing there teaching Beauvoir, and the student said, "But what about me?" And I was like, "This theory is wrong. I am wrong. There's something really wrong here, because you can't explain your philosophy. The theory can't capture being trans. So obviously the theory is wrong." And so in my view, this new type of theory that I present in the book can hold on to a lot of the ideas in postmodern thought. It can hold on to a lot of ideas in naturalist thinking, but it will have the a priori elements that, in my view, you need to be able to explain why people who were trans were always right. Of course they were. But also some people are really very gay, and some people are really very straight. We're not making that up. They are always right about that. Our theory's aim is to explain and help to understand philosophically for those who like or do these things with philosophy. And so part of what I was frustrated in those theories is that it doesn't have philosophical tools to capture it. They say they do, but if I'm being a bit tough, but they don't actually. I don't know if that helped.
Thank you. Oh, it did. Thank you. It gives me a lot to chew on. Thanks.
Thank you.
And finally, Naomi.
This has been an amazing discussion, and I think Klaus's question was terrific, and your answer to it really gives me a lot to mull over and think about, so thank you. I'm wondering, and this is probably something I could answer if, as I should have, I've read more of your work, whether, to what extent you draw on the third critique. Because, I mean, my sort of, overly simplified way of thinking about it is that concordance with other people is necessarily presumed in the terms of the first critique. It's appropriately demanded in the terms of the second critique, but it's desired in the terms of the third critique. And I see this sense of, it's not just I'm experiencing something terrific, you're experiencing something terrific, but we're experiencing something terrific together. And the desire that I have when I'm experiencing something terrific to share it, in some cases perhaps with the world, but in particular cases with someone who's specially matters to me, obviously in the cases of sexual desire, but also in the case of loving a movie or a piece of music, and the disappointment that comes when somebody who's near and dear to me doesn't get it, doesn't like it, hates what I love or whatever. And so I'm wondering about the resources and the extent to which you draw on the resources in the third critique, in the sense of this, the element of desire that enters in there.
Yes. So in some ways, usually, but in some ways, not enough. I really don't feel I mastered the third critique. I keep on reading a few pages and there's, so I really don't feel I master it. But there is a very deep way in which the whole project is inspired or driven by the deep conviction that Kantians need to understand and develop the third critique's tools. And that we haven't is constitutive of how the Kantian discourse has become so disembodied. And so lack of engaging with our earthly being. So yes, but I don't master it yet. So in a sense, I feel I cheat a lot, right? That when I appeal to the third critique, because I don't master it. I just appeal to what the little bits I can do, which is sort of basic teleology and basic aesthetic moves. But all sophistication is beyond my reach yet. But I do want just one little thing, because I sort of promised Eli I would do this and then I never did, which is we do maybe get disappointed a little bit. Here's two versions of that. One is like, oh, right, I really wish you got that. And that's sort of maybe at the level, if you want to do third critique, is the agreeable, right? I know this is at the level of agreeable. I like it. It's not that it's universally beautiful, right? But I wish you could share this because this is so joyful to me, and you can't. On the other hand, it's also the case, I think, that perhaps our expectations to others and them to us is a bit over the top at times, right? So we can't just have one person satisfy all the joys, and we should learn to enjoy a lot of things, even if that particular person can't enjoy it. And of course, with time, sometimes we can open up experiences to each other, right? Depending a little bit on what it is that holds the experience back. But then to the Eli point then that I promised, another thing that I try and use as much as I can, but with still limited philosophical understanding, is the distinction between sexual desire and delight. So I currently draw on the distinction between then letting sexual being desiring, wanting, and then delighting being in just sort of more the aesthetic, letting it please me without that desiring. And that's so that when we develop our sexual, loving, erotic selves, we learn to move between those experiences in the activity itself. That it isn't all sexual wanting, but it's also this ability to just delight in someone else. And like you say, not because all the time is universally everybody would delight in, etc. The sort of, but because it's so deeply agreeable, or the moves, the aesthetic moves, or the way in which another is so delightful, or the way in which somebody reveals themselves to you is just wonderful. And I think those are more moving away from just sexual to more delighting. And there's a way in which when we develop well when life is good to us and we get good people in our lives. It enables us to develop those parts of ourselves, so the activity gets emotionally fuller and more meaningful in that way, I think. I don't know if I even answered your question there, did I?
Was that to me? Yes, I mean, I confess that what I said about the third critique is most of what I know about the third critique. Nowhere near expert.
Read a reading group of the third critique.
Yes. But what you were just saying reminded me of a song lyric where I love you, not just for what you are, but for what I am when I am with you. And that idea of there being parts of who I am, aspects of who I am that I may not have known about, that in a sense may not even really have been there, but are either revealed or emerge in the presence of another. And this gets back to, you know, there not being any essence predetermined of what I really am, but in a sense, it is what I really am, even though I may not exactly have been it before.
Yeah. I love that. And I think absolutely, I mean, there's the way in which when things go well, that there's this tremendous generosity sometimes, but it's also the case that the other sees you better than you see yourself. You know, Hannah Arendt has a beautiful picture of that. She has the picture when she talks about work, actually, or being, maybe it's politics, but anyway, when you're presenting in the world, so you can borrow from that. She says it's a bit like in the ancient philosophy. I don't remember who she got it from. It's like there's a spirit sitting just behind your shoulder, right? And so when you present, you can't see yourself, but it's there. And so the people who see you well, they see it. And so when you are with somebody who truly loves you and cares about you and think you're wonderful, in a sense, they see that little spirit sitting behind you and that just out of you for you, and they're able to let you develop it. And I think that's quite a beautiful image she has for how somebody helps you become more of, in some sense, what you were striving to be already, but had never realized. Thank you.
Helga, thank you so much for the talk and for this really beautiful discussion. And thank you all for coming and joining us today. So let's thank Helga. And our next meeting is October 27th at 1 p.m. Eli put the link to the flyer in the chat. So we're talking about exploring asexuality in October, which is a discussion I'm really excited for. So I hope that you will come back and join us for the rest of SPSL's virtual seminar. And Helga, thank you so much for coming back and getting us going.
Thank you, Eli and Jordan, and thank you, everyone. Fantastic discussion for me, very useful. Thank you for all your generosity. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Helga. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.